Hello, everybody, and welcome. The topic of today is maritime decarbonization. We're going to talk about how do we actually look into maritime decarbonization, looking into the opportunities that's out there for startups, but also trying to understand what's actually going on within maritime decarbonization. My name is Rasmus. I'm the founder and CEO of Reflow. Quick about that, we are also a startup, so it's super interesting and awesome to actually sit here today with a very knowledgeable panel within maritime decarbonization. So the maritime industry, if we just do a quick recap, the maritime industry is responsible for over 80% of the world's goods. And now we are only talking the containerized part of it. But so it's 80% and it's responsible for more than that. So, but let me start off and welcome the panel here. I have on my far, I have Carsten from Dreamcraft Ventures. Welcome, Carsten.
Thank you, Rasmus.
And then I have Cassidy from Cleantech Group. Welcome, Cassidy. And then I have Peter from Mærsk Growth. So today, and also the takeaway for today, is talking about what is you as a startup, what are the opportunity space within maritime decarbonization, and we're also going to talk base about what is it actually looking at in regards to maritime decarbonization. There is a lot of investment going on, and that's can be very interesting. So first of all, welcome everybody. Carsten, do you want to give a quick talk about who you are and where you work from?
For sure. So I'm Carsten Salling. I'm general partner and investment manager in Dreamcraft Ventures, early stage venture fund here in Copenhagen. We are on our first fund at the moment, and we are focused geographically on the Nordics and Germany. We are a generalist fund, but we do have a bit of track record and a lot of passion for certain areas, namely gaming, iGaming and esports, B2B SaaS, consumer tech, direct to consumers, and then actually yesterday where we made an announcement on a new investment, we entered into a new theme that we call Decarbonization with our investment in a German company called FuelSafe.
Super interesting, and that's also why you're here today. We're going to talk about what made you as a venture fund actually go into the maritime decarbonization space. And welcome to the stage, Cassidy. You are joining us all the way from San Francisco, and you are a lead analyst at Cleantech Group, and you're actually working within decarbonization in the market analysis part of that. Do you want to give a brief introduction to that?
Yeah, thank you, Rasmus. So like Rasmus said, I work at Cleantech Group, and we do market research, consulting, and events. And across our three business lines, our goal is to connect corporates and investors and governments with sustainable innovators to help kind of catalyze investments, partnerships, M&A activity, and things like that. So I personally work on the research team covering transportation and logistics. I also do a lot of consulting work, and I also work a little bit in events as well.
And then thank you very much, Cass. And then we've got Peter. Peter is from Mærsk Growth, and Mærsk Growth is the venture arm of Mærsk. And Mærsk have put since, I believe it's 2018, a very aggressive decarbonization strategy. They went out and said within the next, since 2030, 2050, they actually have an aim to be carbon net zero or carbon neutral, right? So that's a huge undertaking, and that's also something that's reflecting in your work, right?
That's right. So Mærsk Growth is an early stage investor. We essentially invest in digitizing, democratizing, and decarbonizing supply chains. We're not a generalist fund. We are there to support Mærsk and its outlook. Decarbonization is a relatively new area for us to invest in. But again, because we invest into the strategy of Mærsk long term, it's a very natural area to expand into.
Now later today, we're going to hear Jakob Sterling, who is also from Mærsk, talking about their decarbonization strategy in more details. But that keys around fuel. What are you doing in Mærsk Growth that is not fuel related? Because you also did a recent investment within a fuel related startup, right?
Yeah, so I mean, we split it relatively simple. There's the maritime side and there's the land side. The maritime side is all about fuels, in principle. 65% of our CO2 emissions is Scope 1, and that's essentially fuels. But 35% is still Scope 3, and that's the land side. We've recently invested in a company called Enride, which essentially is about electrification and autonomous pods, and that's part of looking into, how do we, what do we actually need to decarbonize the whole supply chain? And that's actually quite more complex in a way that it's relatively easy with fuel. Get new fuel. Now, getting the fuel, that's difficult, but it's pretty easy in terms of what you need. The land side decarbonization is much trickier. Involves a lot of people and many more challenges on how do you actually do this, especially because we're not directly involved, obviously, because it's Scope 3.
Scope 3, right? So now Peter brought up something about scopes. So for the rest of you, when we talk about emissions, there are different scopes of emissions. So when we look at the emissions directly emitted from the fuel and the vessels, that's what's called Scope 1. And the tricky part in the decarbonization is actually, as Peter is mentioning here, is the Scope 3. So that's everything that's related to the ship, the running of the vessel, and the whole supply chain. So that's also super interesting. Now, Cassidy, talking about Scope 3 emissions, or at least the maritime industry as a sector, how is that performing like when we talk decarbonization versus other areas?
Yeah, so when you're comparing maritime and road transport, there's kind of two aspects there. There's technology and then there's regulations around emissions. And like Peter said, road transport is really benefiting from electrification in passenger vehicles. The battery technology is getting better, it's getting cheaper, it's more applicable to heavier duty road vehicles now, which is great, but the maritime industry is a little bit different on the technology side. It's more like aviation where the feasibility of electrifying is really, really challenging. So maritime and aviation are having to look at some other types of zero emission fuels or hydrogen, ammonia, methanol, biofuels, all of that. They're having to look at different solutions to decarbonize than road transport. And on the regulation side, road transport it's easier to see the pollution. It's easier to attribute it to a specific company or country. The pollution from trucks is in our cities. It's in our neighborhoods. We're breathing it every day. So countries and cities are really cracking down on emissions. Whereas maritime is more global. It's harder to see the pollution. It's harder to attribute it to one country. So it's easy to just say, we don't know who's doing this. So it's really kind of up to the shipping companies themselves to be leaders in decarbonizing. But at the same time, maritime shipping is much less fragmented than road transportation. So, if one shipping company were to decarbonize all their operations, that would make a huge impact.
That sounds a little bit about the strategy that Mærsk is visioning, right? Super interesting.
Yeah.
Now, Carsten, thank you for joining us here today. You mentioned that you recently just went into the maritime field as a VC. Can you put a few words on that? So what did actually make you go in there? Is that the fuel issue or what was that?
Yeah, so where we are coming from there is, as part of our preparation for our second fund, we were reviewing these core theses that I referred to before, and was also exploring whether we should focus on new areas based on macro, micro trends, our own capabilities, our own network, etc. And we came to the conclusion that decarbonization is just getting started as a really big theme, and we see great opportunities in the space. And with my background, before joining Dreamcraft, I was 9 years with Mærsk, 9 years in the Danish Army. In the Army, I was a supply chain officer. In Mærsk, I was working in procurement, very much focused on the suppliers of Mærsk's performance in all kinds of aspects, obviously service level, cost levels, but also their, so to say, corporate social responsibility, including emissions. So that trend was starting to show when I was in Mærsk. I was part of, in Mærsk Drilling, what I consider the first great step Mærsk did in the decarbonization journey, which was to separate Mærsk Oil, Mærsk Drilling and Mærsk Tankers out of the group and focus on being this integrated logistics. And that really resonated with me. So now Mærsk is moving and been in the industry for some time. I know then a lot will follow. And that's also, I can say, one of the things while we went into decarbonization is that we believe here in Copenhagen we actually have a pretty unique position. One, with my background in a VC, is not a red ocean in terms of ex-maritime people doing traditional VCs, not corporate VC, but also the fact that we have great IT universities, technical universities, we have great companies in maritime in more or less all the verticals that others look towards. And then we have politicians who is really driving the regulations and taking a leading position here, as an example in the Mission Innovation Initiative. And then I want to highlight as well with the recent launch of the Mærsk McKinney Møller Center for Zero Carbon Shipping, we are in a unique position up here. And probably also hence the theme today here at TechBBQ.
Yeah, very good.
Can I just say, I didn't ask him to make that commercial.
Yeah, I was like just looking here and like, okay, was that like a paid, like a drop-in comment?
I'll get you later.
But you recognize that that picture that Carsten is saying that he sees Denmark or actually Copenhagen as a maritime decarbonization hub for all the startups. Are we going to see more maritime decarbonization startups, or is it really a global thing?
So I think it's a global. I mean, let's take it out of the maritime for a second. Being green is a necessity, right? It's not an option. It's not anything. If you're not green and sustainable, you're out of business. Period. I mean, and it doesn't really matter whether you're in maritime or you're a toy manufacturer or H&M for that matter. You're just out of business at some point, and it's going to hit you like a seesaw. Suddenly, you're out. It's not going to come gradually in that way. So for that sense, this is necessary for any business in that sense. Now, yes, we're coming at it obviously from a maritime perspective, and we do have great facilities. The Mærsk McKinney Møller Institute it's an independent setup by the Møller Foundation. Everybody can essentially get access to it, so it's not a Mærsk thing, but also requires a lot of investment, a lot of money, right? And I think that's actually that's where perhaps I'll be a little bit less rosy in terms of Denmark and Copenhagen. We need more investors, we need more risk-willing capital, and we need to mobilize this from, not Dreamcraft, there's a lot of great stuff for sure, but more is needed. You cannot just do it in this way. So, and that's probably a shortage of capital for this piece is to me probably where I'm a little bit less rosy on the outlook. But we got all the facilities, but this is hardware, a lot of it, right? It costs tons of money. And that we need to mobilize, which is also what we do in Mærsk. That's why we're so verbal about it. Everybody's going to have to pitch in here. Otherwise, it won't happen.
And that makes me think, Carsten, you have a
maybe
comment?
just a short comment to further cement the point about Copenhagen's position here. So with the investment we made in FuelSafe, it is no big secret that there were many others interested in investing in FuelSafe, from Spain, from UK, from Germany, obviously. But Mark, the founder of FuelSafe, was very focused on getting an investment up here in Copenhagen because of all the reasons I just mentioned. And I think that is, a really specific example for, so to say, cementing that point. And if anyone want to explore this with Mark, the founder of FuelSafe, then he's actually sitting right here in the audience.
Okay, now we're going to sales
you can quiz with him afterwards.
Wonderful. But Cassidy, so that whole funding, like the need for funding, do you guys see that there are more funding available now for decarbonization, or how is that going, especially in the maritime segment? Or is it like, what are the trends out there?
Yeah, there's definitely more funding available across the board. There's a lot of institutional investors getting into the space, putting a lot of money into, a lot of different startups and innovators that are working on decarbonization. Certain sectors are definitely lagging a bit, but I don't think there's not enough funding available. To a certain extent there is, but I think there needs to be more of a market for the technology in the maritime space so that they can prove that there is a market and they can then attract investment because they can show that there can be a return. So I think that's a huge challenge right now in some harder to abate sectors that, corporates are either not being forced to purchase that technology or become customers of the innovators, or they don't, have the will or the funding or what have you. So I say it's more on the kind of demand side rather than the supply side, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So being being a startup myself, I'm super interested. Where do you actually see the investments are gonna? What areas are startups? Is it SaaS platforms? Is it technology? Where do you actually see opportunity space for the startups out there? What do we actually need to do as a startup? Getting the good ideas goes one thing, but yeah.
Yes, so I think a key focus for us, we in the decarbonization theme, we can invest both hardware and software. But we believe that at least currently, the technologies that can really impact the root causes of the heavy carbon footprints in the maritime space, that is hardware. Software can help us detect it. Where are the issues? And measure our performance on the decarbonization journey. But the really value-adding, so to say, technologies are those that fixes the root causes. And currently, it's new fuels or it's new hardware. And that's also where that was a natural place for us to start. So I would really be focusing on looking at the root causes, because that's where the really valuable problems are to be solved. And yes, that is extremely complicated, and maybe even more complicated in a maritime industry with a lot of, so to say, companies with very long traditions and maybe a bit conservative, also heavily regulated, and those things are obviously related.
So regulation, Cassidy, is that a big thing for the maritime industry? Do you see that as something that's dragging down the innovation in the industry? Like there are other industries that's equally regulated? Or?
Yeah, I think emissions regulations are not really driving the industry like they are in other sectors. So like I mentioned before, I think it's really up to the companies working in the space to kind of be leaders and move before the regulation. I mean, frankly, the IMO is a really slow-moving organization. But one thing I'd add to what Carsten said and to your previous question, and one thing I'm hearing a lot from investors that are investing in clean tech and decarbonization is that, prove it. Prove that you can actually make a difference. Prove that you can reduce emissions by a significant amount. I think it was Climate Tech VC that just released this tool that startups can use to kind of do a quick calculation of how many tons of carbon they can actually abate, what's their actual emissions reductions, and I think we're going to be seeing a lot more of that from investors. They want proof and evidence from startups that they can, reduce emissions and actually do what they say they're doing.
So we're looking at more data. We're looking at a data-driven decarbonization, or at least we need that.
Science-based, yeah.
We need to base it on science, need to base it on some kind of a baseline before we can actually change it. A very good point. Is that also along the strategy that Mærsk is looking at, getting a more science-based approach?
Yeah, so we will sign. I mean, we got a target of neutral by 2050, and I think what's important to note here is that sounds like great. Entire management and middle management is going to be retired by 2050, right? So who cares? But in order to achieve that by 2050, we need to start executing on a plan about 2025. We got 700 ships that needs to be changed, potentially. They cost a pretty penny, so it cannot be done in hours. So our actions actually needs to be mobilized much earlier in that sense. We will also come with science-based targets is what we're gonna sign up to, so we really get them. We're quite keen on getting some early movers into towards 2030 because there's quite some the emission gap there is quite a problem, which I think actually has not been talked about enough. But that's a different thing. I do think though, and I think that from an impact perspective, the prove it point is really good, because this is such an urgent platform for companies. You need to prove it has substantial impact. Otherwise, the attention span of corporates, if you're coming and saying, I can reduce this and that by a couple of percent, forget it. It just won't work. Chris Sacca, who was on the stage yesterday, said they only invest in something that can have 1 gigaton reduction potential as a solution, right? And maybe that's maybe that's aggressive, but it's back to the point. Prove it. And as I said earlier, I think I said it yesterday on stage and other places as well, green is not a proposition. It's a qualifier and a license to play. But don't bring something in to a corporate and think, I'm green, so it's going to sell itself. No. Green lets you through the door. Now you need to prove it works.
And that makes me think a little bit because we're also working within the maritime space. And many times when we go out to suppliers and offering our value proposition, they say, well, it sounds very good and we want to develop and innovate greener products, but the ship owners are not willing to pay more for it. Is that where we are right now? We have all these ambitions, but there's not the willingness to pay? Or
I think the willingness to pay is linked maybe to regulation not being there, other bits and pieces. There are companies very clearly saying, we want green logistics. We're not going to pay more for it, so you just have to figure it out. Okay. I think this will have to, it'll find its level over time. Yeah. This is going to cost more money initially, so everybody will have to contribute one way or the other.
I read somewhere that the whole budget on the maritime decarbonization over the next 20 years is like $1.6 trillion US. So there's going to be a lot of money in the maritime space. Yeah, very good. Yeah, Carsten.
Just a small comment. You asked about the data and the SaaS play. Just one, so to say, challenge I just want to highlight here is that maybe especially in the maritime, the data that is really important related to decarbonization is for many operators and OEM quite sensitive operational performance data as well as emission performance data. So we're also seeing different strategies being pursued here. I mean, we saw Mærsk yesterday announce their own kind of proprietary system with all the sensors collecting and probably being kept in-house. And there are others who are trying to take a more open source approach and offer it as a service to the operators, and that's a challenge to navigate because typically this data has been very important to the operators and OEMs.
And that's a little bit of siloed approach as we're known for in the maritime industry. We're like, oh, we don't want to share data. But looking at the whole decarbonization challenge, we need to share data, right? That's one of the points there.
For me, that is key, right? I think the whole industry on all levels in the value chain needs to align around the concept of better business, better planet. And to do that, they need to share data and collaborate much more through partnerships, through open innovation, all these kinds of things. And we see good movements in that. Yeah. I mean, maybe some of the accelerators as well that we have here in Copenhagen. We have some strong run in Singapore as well, really bringing startups and corporates together where you break down these barriers. You also even bring in the OEMs in many cases. So I think that's really key.
Yeah, very good. Just to remind everybody that you can actually join on the Slido and write your questions. So if you have any questions to the panel here, feel free to ask them. And I think, how does the access to soft funding look at the moment? Like soft funding for startups in the maritime decarbonization area, how is that looking? Like, do you guys?
Yeah. So my impression is that it is good and it is improving both on a national but also on an EU level with the introduction of various grant schemes and access to other kinds of soft funding. I think as a theme, there is support everywhere around, so to say, unlocking some of the challenges related to financing and cost. One is soft funding to the startups, but we are also seeing subsidies being imposed by the governments. We are seeing new financing vehicles that is financing operators' investment in energy efficiency and emission reduction technologies with private means from big pension funds, etc., so that you can move it over on an OPEX side instead of a big CapEx investment. So I think there is a support everywhere at the moment.
Yeah. Very good. Do you recognize that as on some of your investments that you have done at Mærsk Growth? Is soft funding, of course, playing an important part of that in the early stage?
We like it, right? It's non-dilutive and so forth in that sense. I think so more is coming, and it's great in support of this. I think I'd raise a sort of a slight cautionary comment, that is that there's no pressure from soft funding, and if you need pressure because you need to, this is hardware, most of it, so that it right now, the sort of the time to product is too long. Yeah, it's simply too long. It needs to be brought down. You need to think creatively around how you deploy your capital, not go out and build a trial plant here and a trial plant there, but maybe, rent space temporarily or something like whatever it might be. You need investors or partners at least that puts pressure on you. And soft funding does not do that. It's great from a capital perspective, but it doesn't come with somebody who's watching over you like a hawk. And that's what you need.
Yeah, that's true. What we see right now is also the whole power to X in the maritime industry is receiving a lot of subsidies, a lot of soft funding. So you're also saying that it's fine with all the soft funding for the power to X. It's going to enable something, but then we also need to actually make it commercial fast and make it work.
It needs. Listen, I don't think I'm gonna offend anyone by saying that within this space, it's a lot of engineers, it's a lot of people who are really, really clever, but it's not necessarily business people. So you end up at a TRL 9 suddenly, but your commercialization is TRL 1. And of course, if you graduate from Harvard, then you have TRL 9 on commercial and 1 on technology, right? So that's sort of the opposite of it. I just think that there's an element you have to bring this together. Yeah. You can do that with advisory boards, you can do it with other bits and pieces, but you also do that by bringing in, for instance, investors like Cassidy, they want return on their money. They want to talk about effective deployment of capital, whether it's soft funding or not. Show me that you're not just pissing this away.
Very good. So would there be a change now? You're a corporate-backed venture, right? And you're a full-on venture. Would that be a different ways on how you're investing right now in the maritime? Or, of course, you guys have focused with the whole maritime decarbonization focus, and that will also look through your investments, right?
I think you should not look at a corporate as investing very differently from how we handle our investments. A bad investment is a bad investment, right? No matter who invests into it. I think the main difference might be that we may be slightly more patient in terms of duration because we don't have an LP we need to pay back 3x. But fundamentally, I look at the investments in the exact same way as Carsten does.
Yeah.
No, I would echo that. Maybe one difference is that over with Peter, the focus will be maritime, obviously. Our thesis is decarbonization broadly. So we can also invest in other, sort of say, verticals than maritime. And one could be energy. Again, where Denmark has a very strong position and also a fit with my background.
So that's the next big thing you're looking for now is within the energy...
Could be.
Yeah. Okay, very good. Any other questions out there? Feel free to ask them. We still have a couple of minutes left. Okay, we have one here. With the regulations in the maritime decarbonization, do you see more or less regulation in maritime, and what kind of effect will it have on the decarbonization agenda? I think we touched base on it a little bit before, right, Cassidy?
Yeah, we touched on it a little bit. I think the kind of overarching theme is that in terms of emissions, there are not as many regulations in the maritime industry in terms of net zero and getting to net zero. There are regulations around, mitigating fuel use. There's some, blending regulations, but in terms of getting to net zero, it's not as aggressive as other sectors. Certainly, like other sectors are really aggressive about electrification targets, net zero targets, but maritime industry, not quite the same.
Interesting. Yeah. Any other questions you have? Oh, how will the challenges brought by COVID to the supply chain affect decarbonization? That's a good one, right? Yeah, Carsten.
Happy to give my view on that. I think that applies for all hardware businesses right now, that managing your supply chain is extremely complicated. We see lead times on some cases where things are suddenly doubled with very, very short notice. And the combination of COVID and then suddenly a ship stuck in Suez and God knows what, it just means that our supply chain is extremely stretched at the moment. And clever people in the industry indicate that, we are not at the end yet. It might be 6 or 12 months before we are back to normal. And that's what happens to supply chain. When suddenly the chain gets broken at some point, then you will have a period where things goes like this until we are back to normal.
I think the one thing that you can add here is that, so listen, we've spent the last 50 years on honing supply chains down to a T, right? with just in time, this and that. Every year you take cost out and so forth. I mean, we're kind of in this by our own making. Not us here necessarily, but businesses, right? But what it does is it now requires, there's a bigger desire to have visibility, right? And understand your supply chain, where it comes from and so forth. And that will actually very likely bring along almost like a free gift, visibility on the emissions of your supply chain, right? So it's a data capture and visibility thing. So you will through this actually very likely get faster pace towards getting visibility on your emissions in particular, and that might therefore help in fast pacing some of those reductions and so forth. So actually, I think that's a side effect from it.
Actually, a good thing.
Yeah.
Very good. Any other questions? Yeah, I think we're getting very close here. You talk about the core problem, fuel and hardware. What about using digitalization? Do you see novel IT solution be able to rethink the space and save? That's a tough one, huh?
Listen, digital is part of all of it, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it should not be looked at as a different discipline. I guess software is an optimization. Once you get visibility, you need software to do this, right? I think, but fundamentally, the hardware component or a big part of this is still how do you electrify, right? How do we get out of electricity? I mean, it's actually start doing the math. If everybody has an electrical car, just in Denmark, we'll be out of electricity. I mean, so just investments that need to go into this. So it's not solved, but it's further enhanced and optimized through looking through software and so forth. But it's just a hardware thing to start with.
Okay. Thank you so much, Carsten from Dreamcraft. Thank you so much, Cassidy from Cleantech. And thank you so much, Peter, for joining me here on stage and put a little light onto the maritime decarbonization and what's going on in this space. Thank you so much for joining us here for this talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.